Well, hello and welcome to No Spin. I'm Nidhi Razdan. Rishi Sunak formally took over as the UK's Prime Minister today after being appointed by King Charles at Buckingham Palace. Speaking after that, Sunak said that he had been elected to fix the mistakes of his predecessor, promising to unite the country. He has, of course, created history by becoming the first non-white Prime Minister of Britain. He is also, of course, a practicing Hindu and at the age of 42 is the youngest Prime Minister that the UK has seen in this generation. Let's first listen to what he said.
I want to pay tribute to my predecessor, Liz Truss. She was not wrong to want to improve growth in this country. It is a noble aim. And I admired her restlessness to create change. But some mistakes were made. Not born of ill will or bad intentions. Quite the opposite, in fact. But mistakes nonetheless. And I have been elected as leader of my party and your Prime Minister, in part, to fix them. I will place economic stability and confidence at the heart of this government's agenda. This will mean difficult decisions to come. But you saw me during COVID doing everything I could to protect people and businesses with schemes like furlough. There are always limits, more so now than ever.
Well, there's also been a fierce political debate back home here in India about Britain's multiculturalism and whether there are lessons for India as well, and particularly Shashi Tharoor of the Congress party, who finds himself in the eye of yet another political storm. He joins us now on NDTV. Shashi Tharoor, thanks very much for being with us. Let me draw attention to that tweet that we're talking about that you had put out after Rishi Sunak's elevation, and you said that as we Indians celebrate the ascent of Rishi Sunak, let's honestly ask, can it happen here? We have to acknowledge that the Brits have done something very rare to place a member of a visible minority in the most powerful office. Now, the BJP has attacked you for this, and others have also pointed out that we've had Dr. Manmohan Singh, a Sikh, as Prime Minister for 10 years, that we have had Muslims as presidents. Therefore, was your comment misplaced?
Well, I would say, first of all, that, Dr. Manmohan Singh absolutely does belong to a visible minority, but most Hindus do not see Sikhs as particularly different from themselves. Can we still imagine the day in our increasingly majoritarian polity that the BJP is, of course, very much behind, when someone who is not Hindu, Sikh or Jain or Buddhist can head our national government? I mean, I'm being very blunt because, we know that Hindutva has a certain philosophy that says that the authentic Indians, the people who can lay claim to the term Hindu, are the people from Indic religions, people whose faith was born in the soil. So Hindu, Sikh, Jain, Buddhists are all seen in the same way. But they don't consider others welcome. They certainly, when Sonia Gandhi ji was offered the prime ministership by her victorious coalition, and I guess she would qualify as an immigrant, there were public fulminations about a foreigner ruling billion Indians, and one prominent politician, you know who she is, threatened to shave her head and conduct a dharna outside Parliament in protest. So Sonia Gandhi chose to decline. Now, that is the kind of situation that you haven't obviously got any parallels for in Britain. So I do believe that we have to acknowledge, and I've been a very strong critic of the British and British racism, but here they've chosen to anoint as their leader a brown-skinned Hindu, a member of a minority that represents just over 7% of their population, and what is more, after a history which was certainly associated with overt racism and a culture of racial discrimination that they exported with them to the colonies they ruled during centuries of imperial conquest and oppression. So given all of that, I would argue that what they've done is how they've outgrown. What's remarkable about the British is how they've outgrown their worst attributes. Whereas I'm sorry to say in India, I'm not sure we're ready to claim that yet.
Right. So
long ago, the British were running clubs where people of color were disallowed. I remember in my childhood in Bombay, there was still the Beach Candy Swimming Club where no Indians were allowed to step. It was a completely whites-only club.
Yeah.
The same with the Calcutta Swimming Club up to 1969. So today, these same Brits have a prime minister from an ethnicity that most British people in those days would have regarded and treated with contempt.
Are you, Shashi
And so That, I think, is something we have to acknowledge. It's really special.
Are you therefore saying that there's a difference between India pre and post 2014?
Well, there is that too. I mean, we're sidetracking the conversation, Rishi. I'm talking about what we can learn from Rishi Sunak's triumph, as it were, because it really is a triumph. Race is one major factor, but it's not the only factor. Look at his overt faith in and practice of Hinduism. This is the faith that Churchill, you remember, notoriously sneered that Hindus are a beastly people with a beastly religion. And here he is, not only somebody who practices Hindu faith, does so openly, took his ministerial oath on a copy of the Bhagavad Gita. Even while campaigning for the leadership of the Tory party earlier this year, he tweeted photos and videos of himself performing cow worship and praying to Lord Krishna on Janmashtami. And you know, this is remarkable. Can you imagine, say, an overt Christian or an overt Muslim who's public about their faith and practicing, being embraced by the BJP as a fit Prime Minister of India? I mean, I just don't think that the BJP is, I think they're being disingenuous. I don't think they're being honest when they claim that we've already got to where the British have got to, because on this one, I mean, there was a point made by somebody that the then Prime Minister, that is now the outgoing Prime Minister, read aloud from the Bible at the Queen's funeral service earlier this year. And they're asking, can a Hindu Prime Minister do that on a similar occasion? Now, my answer, I've not asked him, but I can imagine that like most Hindus, he would answer yes, because Hindus of the kind that's not the Hindutva kind have no difficulty venerating the beliefs and the sacred texts of other faiths. So Rishi Sunak's Hinduism is also something the British had to swallow. Third thing that the BJP will not talk about is the stark fact of his age. The guy's 42. His parliamentary career began in 2015, Nidhi. Can you imagine that, within 5 years, he's the finance minister, he's the chancellor of the exchequer. And within 7 years of his first ever election, he's the prime minister of the country. Now, in our country, and I don't just blame the BJP, I blame all parties, he'd still be occupied the backbenches of any ruling party, sporting at best a Minister of State tag, right? I mean, an MOS is how much a 42-year-old with 7 years in Parliament can expect to get. So, I mean, look at the differences that this elevation is showing us. I'm glad we're celebrating it because I'm hoping it'll make us reflect a little bit on our own country and the things we take for granted here.
Right. Well, another interesting point that is made by some is that, Rishi Sunak was elected by MPs from his party and not the general public, and therefore, would the result have been different if he had actually been on the ballot?
Well, the fact is that we're going to find out. I think the good thing for Rishi is that he has now 2 or 3 years almost to actually demonstrate his performance and then go to the polls on the basis of a track record, which I think it's fair to say that if they were hiring a prime minister, if he had come in as a party leader challenging for position without the track record that he's already got and that he can still acquire, he may have had a problem. I wasn't totally surprised when between Liz Truss and him, even though he was manifestly the more qualified candidate, he lost. And he lost because the vote shifted from the MPs, where he was leading massively, to the general Tory membership, where he trailed. He trailed not that badly. I think it was 53 to 47, I think, in that election. No, 57 to 43. So it wasn't a great, it wasn't close, but it still was a defeat in the larger membership and not amongst the MPs. So we know that people who've seen him close at work respect his capacity. The British have had an economic meltdown under Truss. The last 45 days have been a disaster for the economy. They wanted a safe pair of hands. Here's a man who's worked in the private sector, worked on sort of Wall Street, worked in England in hedge funds. He knows the economy inside out. He's did pretty well in managing COVID from the financial point of view with his bailouts for businesses, 80% of salaries for those laid off, all those things. He came across as a safe pair of hands. And so there was clearly a question of either you go for this guy or you face a general election because you're not going to be able to find someone who can do as good a job of managing the economy. And that's, again, a wonderful thing that his merit and his ability trumped other considerations. When the British have to say, they basically accepted that here's somebody who can do the job. Let's not worry about his colors. Let's not worry about his religion. Let's not worry about his origin. He can do the job this country needs. I mean, that sort of thing, again, the sheer emphasis on merit is something that we could all benefit to learn from and applaud.
All right, Shashi Tharoor, thanks very much for joining us as that interesting development takes place in the UK and creates a political storm back home. Who would have thought? Thanks very much. Joining us on NDTV now is the UK's High Commissioner to India, Alex Ellis. Thanks very much, High Commissioner, for being with us. I want to begin with a WhatsApp forward that made me smile for a change today, which says the UK has a Hindu Prime Minister, it has a Muslim Mayor of London and a Christian King. How significant a moment is this for Britain?
I think it is important. It marks a moment. It's not a total surprise. The UK, which I grew up in, is a very different United Kingdom from the United Kingdom today. It's a more diverse United Kingdom. It's a place which is attracting talent from all over the world. You went through the Mayor of London, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and the King of the United Kingdom. They're all British, of course. And I think that we are attracting great people to work and be part of our country.
The fact that Rishi Sunak is also a practicing Hindu and something, he's very open about, isn't that also very new and significant for the UK?
You're right. That's one of the aspects of what makes our new Prime Minister a bit different from some of his predecessors. He's young as well, and his grandparents came from India and his parents came from East Africa. So it is something new and something different. But as I say, the United Kingdom itself has changed quite a lot. And what it's doing is changing over time, the concept of Britishness changes. It doesn't stay still for any country, I don't think. And that concept, compared to when my grandfather, for example, who served in the Indian Army in 16 Punjabis, it's a different country today. So we can look forward to the future with that strength which our diversity gives us.
What does the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak then mean for India-UK ties, and in particular for a free trade agreement that the two countries have been trying so hard to put together?
Well, I would emphasise the continuity of the British policy towards India, particularly since we left the European Union. Successive Prime Ministers have fixed and then pursued a course of a much, much closer relationship between the UK and India, much closer partnership. I think that's been reciprocated from the Indian side as well. And there are good reasons for that. The opportunities which, having left the European Union, that gives us in terms of our migration policy and our trade policy. The fact we are in an era now of clear geopolitical competition, I think COVID accelerated that trend as well. So whether it's on trade, as you mentioned, whether that's on defence, whether that's on climate change, whether that's on the living bridge, which Prime Minister Modi referred to and tweeted about our new Prime Minister yesterday, those are all policies actually which have been of continuity over the last couple of Prime Ministers, and I would expect the same from this Prime Minister as well.
All right, High Commissioner Alex Ellis, thanks very much for joining us on Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister. Well, he's one of the finest minds in medicine today. Dr. Siddharth Mukherjee, oncologist and professor of medicine at Columbia University, New York, has a new book that's just been released today. It's The Song of the Cell, which looks at the very basis of our existence. Through the stories of real-life patients, Dr. Mukherjee takes us through an amazing journey of how human cells were discovered and how these are being used today to revolutionize medical treatments for diseases like cancer. His earlier book, The Emperor of Maladies, won a Pulitzer Prize and helped millions of cancer patients and their families around the world. Dr. Siddharth Mukherjee joins us on NDTV now. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Mukherjee. You've done a great service actually writing books which explain complex medical issues to all of us, particularly cancer. And this book, The Song of the Cell, goes back to where it all begins, how all of us are made up of cells, how these were discovered, and how they're being used now in new treatments to treat diseases. How did the idea of writing about this come to you?
Well, after I finished my last book, The Gene, I began to think about how genes are made, are enlivened. A gene or a molecule of DNA is lifeless without the cell. It is just a molecule, it's a chemical. And my question really became, what happens at the next level of complexity? What is the next level of human complexity, of the complexity of the body? And so I really began to gravitate towards cells and cells as potential loci of therapy as I thought about how we might imagine the next sort of stage of our lives as, next level of medicine, as it were. And that's how I came about cells and cell therapy.
Well, you've written about what were once considered radical new technologies and the ethical debates that they sparked at that time. For instance, the first in vitro fertilization, the first stem cell transplants, etc. In other words, medicine and science keep evolving, and what we think is radical today becomes normal tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, the great example is IVF. I mean, in vitro fertilization, hundreds of thousands of babies have been born with in vitro fertilization. But when it was first conceived, people thought that it was just unethical. That, lots of people thought that infertility is not a disease. And so therefore, why treat something that's not a disease? Now, the book makes a very radical distinction between disease and desire. That distinction is, of course, very important because people thought, oh gosh, we've been living with infertility, and some people don't think that it's a problem. They still don't think it's a problem. But for some other people, it's an aching form of suffering. So you have this question of, infertility and IVF. And when IVF was first conceived, a lot of people argued that it wasn't a disease and therefore should not be treated.
You're also passionately involved in a project here in India to make T-cell therapy for leukemia and lymphoma accessible for everyone. Now, there's a clinical trial which is underway on this. Tell us more about why this therapy is so important.
Well, it's a very radical therapy in which patients with relapsed refractory leukemia, these are leukemias that are no longer responsive to standard therapy, are treated with their own T cells. Those T cells are genetically modified in the laboratory and grown in the laboratory for 14 days and then returned back to the patients. It's very radical. It's very, in the United States, it's extremely expensive. It costs anywhere $500,000 to $600,000. We wanted to make that therapy available in India. I collaborated with Kiran Shaw and Kush Parmar, created an entire factory. This is not any kind of factory. This is not like a nuts and bolts factory. This is a place that has to be extremely sterile. And also the diseases that we're treating are very, very dangerous. These patients are almost at the edge of death. And the therapy itself is toxic. So you have to start off with the understanding that, the therapy itself can be potentially toxic and kill you. But if it's successful, we can cure about 70-80% of these patients who would otherwise be completely left without any options and died from the leukemia that they originally had. So we have started these trials. We are in midway. And I have to say that I can't tell you the results yet because, of course, we're still in the midway of these trials. But we are trying to provide the therapy for children, for kids. And there's nothing really like watching someone who's 10 years old with a lethal leukemia really come alive after the therapy. But as I said, I mean, these are not simple things to do. These are very toxic therapies, and there will be, of course, a certain number of toxicities associated with these therapies per se.
You've also written in this book about COVID, and very simply, you said that we have learned so much, and yet we have so much left to learn. So what did COVID teach you?
Well, we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot about the immune system. It was very unanticipated. We've learned about a lot about how COVID causes very severe disease. It was an incredible medical mystery. It still remains somewhat of a medical mystery, but we've learned how COVID causes this very severe disease, and it's by paralyzing some parts of the immune system while activating some other parts of the immune system. The virologist Akiko Iwasaki, who's a very famous virologist, calls it immunological misfiring. It's like an army that's firing in the wrong direction. And so we've learned a lot about COVID in that sense, but there are many, many medical mysteries that are still to be solved about how it evades the immune system, why you can have so many repeat infections, and so forth. So those are mysteries that we're still trying to solve. But, the creation of new vaccines against COVID and the possibility that we can actually immunize ourselves against this deadly virus has been a great learning experience for all of us.
What kind of treatments then are we looking at in the near future as far as cancer is concerned? You've talked about T-cell therapy, but are you more optimistic today about the kind of treatments that are available to people?
Absolutely, we are more optimistic. We're learning how to harness the human immune system against cancer, which is a very big step. This was not possible 10 years ago. Immunotherapy is now part of the standard protocol against cancer. My own laboratory is trying to use diets against cancer, to use not just diets in a prevention manner, but in a therapeutic manner against cancer. So we are trying very hard to understand how cancers depend on certain nutrients and harness those. We are learning how to prevent some kinds of cancers using ones that are caused by viruses, using new novel vaccines, and of course CAR T or T-cell therapy. Now all of these are, as I said, they have costs that are associated with them because in cancer, unfortunately, nothing comes for free. And so we're also learning how to harness the toxicities against with these therapies for cancer. But there's a whole gamut of new therapies that everyone is involved in. The whole community of cancer researchers is involved in, and all of them are novel.
Why do you think, finally, Dr. Mukherjee, that it's important for you to write the way that you do, simplifying this, mystical world of science and medicine for all of us? Some of your peers have criticized you. They say you oversimplify things, but others believe you're doing an important service.
Well, I think it's important to simplify because it's impossible to read a 500-page book in which you talk about, CTLA4, BA 4.2, and so forth. I think that would become unreadable. No one would read it. No one would understand it. I think it's important because it gives patients and the public a kind of autonomy that is not otherwise available. I mean, imagine you were reading about economics and you had no clue about supply and demand, and you had no clue about the more complex aspects of economics. So, I try to reach what I think is a kind of balance between simplification, avoiding, and in this book especially, I've moved. There's a huge index and a huge epilogue and chapter after chapter afterwards, in which you can go into great depth, and I provide primary references. Yeah. Where if you really are interested in deepening your knowledge about all of this, you can go in and deepen your knowledge. But I think the public, patients especially who are afflicted by these diseases, need to know what is going on and how to understand it, so that they can then therefore be able to understand what they're being treated with and how.
Well, the Song of the Cell is out today. Congratulations on that, Dr. Siddharth Mukherjee. Thank you very much for joining us on NDTV. Thank you.